welcome to Fuqua. I am exceptionally excited to have the opportunity to moderate this panel on such an exceptionally important topic. As Gwen mentioned, I'm on faculty here at Fuqua, where I teach a negotiations course as well as a women in leadership course. And much of my research is on diversity and leadership, specifically on race and gender, intersectionality. However, I am not an entrepreneurial scholar. So I am hoping to learn as much as you are from our esteemed panel. And so let's kick it off and just ask our panelists to introduce themselves. And then I'll jump in with the questions. And the goal is to maybe have about 30, 40 minutes of discussion by our panelists, and then open it up for about 30 minutes of Q&A. Sound good? Good. All righty, and we'll start here.
Hi, everyone. I'm Monique Woodard. I'm a venture capital investor based in San Francisco. So I'm one of the 3% that our lunch keynote speaker mentioned. I was at a fund. I started my career in investing at a fund called 500 Startups, where I invested in the US as well as Africa. And then I left 500 Startups to start a new fund called Cake Ventures that I'm raising right now. Across all of my investing, angel investing, as well as venture capital investing, I've invested in recently turned into 55% of my deals have been in companies led by women, and 60% of my deals have been in companies led by underrepresented founders of some sort. So that may mean Black, Latinx, LGBTQ, veterans. And I've also been working with Rockefeller Foundation, starting a foundation in Living Cities to work with 3 cities, New Orleans, Albuquerque, New Mexico, and San Francisco, on how to create new capital constructs that deliver inclusive investing and more equitable outcomes for entrepreneurs of color in those cities. I think that small business is really important to our cities, but I focus primarily on high growth businesses that create dozens, if not hundreds of jobs, create anchor institutions in cities, and where new companies can spin out of those anchor institutions.
Awesome, thank you. Melissa.
Hi, my name is Dr. Melissa Abad. I have a PhD in sociology. I am currently a research scientist at the Stanford VMware Women's Leadership Lab, where I focus on the occupational trajectories of women of color in tech and finance. Really just asking the question, what strategies do we use to navigate corporate America, and what's corporate America doing to either keep us in or push us out? And so I also want to say thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. To be in a room of Black excellence is, it doesn't happen very often when you get these letters, so it's great to be here.
Hello, everyone, again. I am Fenaba Addo. I am currently an assistant professor of consumer science. I'm also the Lorna Jorgensen Wendt Professor of Money, Relationships, and Equality at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm actually currently visiting at the Sanford School of Public Policy here at Duke University, and am an affiliate of the Cook Center for this academic year. So my work, or my research, broadly speaking, examines the role of increasing wealth inequality in our society and debt for family and households. And in particular, I've been looking at the role of wealth inequality amongst older women and young adults. And more recently, a lot of my work has focused on racial disparities in student loan debt and the short and long-term consequences of debt for young adult households. And I just had a couple of reports come out, one on the millennial racial wealth gap, which I'm sure some people will like to discuss a little bit more about that, but also how we think about debt, how it differs amongst different populations, what is meant by good and bad debt, and how we think about what student loan debt, how student loan debt is operating the lives of Black borrowers. So I've been working a lot around those topics, but I can also speak to, as I said, racial wealth inequality amongst women and young adults. So.
Awesome, thank you so much. Monique, let's start with you. So in your introduction, you quoted some facts that I'm sure were pretty eye-opening to a lot of us, and that you've had a lot of success, and 55% of your investments have been with women-owned companies. How does that happen without a mandate? You know, numerous funds and numerous entities say, you know, the purpose is to invest in, you know, Black and Latinx companies and so on. You, however, have done it successfully without that mandate. How does that happen in that way?
Yeah, so, you know, I think there are a lot of funds out there that are taking the strategy of being very specific about that mandate. And those funds are out there and they're very early and very nascent, so it's hard to tell, you know, how successful that will be. I've never had a mandate around the types of founders that I invest in, but I have a really broad network of amazing women who are starting companies, amazing people of color, especially Black and Latinx, who are starting companies. And I think it takes, one, you need to be, you know, a investor of color who has a seat at the table. I think that so many of the funds and, you know, whether it's private equity or venture capital, just don't have anyone around the table. You look at their team page and it's, you know, 6 white men in hoodies who all went to Stanford together. And that's obviously not me. And so, you know, when I come to the table, I come with a very different network. And so if your network is very homogenous, you are going to invest in the same kind of person over and over again. My network tends to be a lot more diverse, and so I'm able to invest in very different people. I think the other really big and really important piece is that you have to give these investors autonomy and the ability to write checks. Because just because you have a seat at the table doesn't mean you can write a check. You've still got to go into that Monday morning partner meeting and sell this investment in Blavity and have them ask why is like a media platform for Black millennials important, right? And so if you are the only one at the table, you're not going to get that deal through. If you are the person, the fund manager of your fund, like where I'm moving into, and you have check writing authority, you are going to get that deal done. And so I think it's twofold of you know, more Black and Latinx and women fund managers being able to go out and raise significantly sized funds. You know, it's really a shame that not very many women fund managers, and especially not very many women of color fund managers, have been able to raise a fund over, let's say, $10 or so million, right? That's not a lot of money in the venture capital industry. And so it's going to take family offices, corporates, insurance companies, pension funds, all these places where venture funds and private equity funds get capital from to say, look, we are going to invest in a Black woman fund manager and give her the authority to make these early stage deals.
Right, I think you're highlighting a very important point, right? And that is, it helps when you're the decision maker.
Yeah.
Right? Someone I've followed is Arlen Hamilton. I know you don't talk a lot about the backstage, but for those of you who don't know her, she had, you know, right? You know her, and so her goal was to raise enough capital to fund a $36 million fund, such that and the sole purpose would be to invest in Black women, right? And so, but there's difficulty in doing that and challenges that that she's faced in doing that. But she's attempting to be a decision maker and to be at the table, which is where you are, which is why you're telling us that you've had quite a bit of success. Which
yeah, and we need more of us who have that opportunity to be decision makers. I mean, Arlen should be able to raise a $36 million fund, a $50 million fund, whatever.
Right.
But we haven't been able to get there yet.
Right.
And so figuring out how to hack that ability to get there and to get down the road with family offices, endowments, all those people who make decisions is really important. And if we don't figure it out, it's going to stymie our ability to invest in these entrepreneurs who have great ideas and great companies. If
you had to list, like, in your opinion and in your vast experience, that number one barrier that you think is the thing that prevents this from going to the next level, what would you speculate, or what would you think that it is?
Well, I think, people ask me all the time, what are the barriers for entrepreneurs of color? And I say it's two things. It's access to a network and it's access to capital.
Right.
You solve those two things, and everything else is a little bit easier, right? And people will succeed or fail on their own terms. Right. Well, for fund managers and investors of color, it's the same thing. It's access to a network, access to capital. Access to a network meaning for, let's say, a fund one, you need to be able to go out to high net worth individuals and get them to invest in your fund. If you don't have a network of high net worth individuals, you are not going to raise a lot of money, right? Or you need to be able to have institutional investors say, okay, we're willing to invest in an emerging manager, where an emerging manager does not mean I just spun out of Sequoia with a partner that I've worked with for the last 10 years, right? Because there are no Black partners at Sequoia. And I'm picking on Sequoia, but there are no Black partners at a lot of firms. So it's those same two things. It's access to a network and access to the capital.
Yeah, echoing some of the things we saw in the report that was out. I'm going to shift a little bit, and I'm going to come back to you, and I'm going to go to Fenaba and just and ask you a question about your research. So much of your research focuses on understanding wealth inequality, as you noted in your introduction. Can you tell us how your research better informs our understanding of the gender wealth gap?
Sure. So I'm going to set the stage a little bit. I feel like we've been talking, starting from the beginning this morning. And to just be clear, when we're talking about wealth, right? So wealth, definitionally, it's the difference between total value of your assets minus your liabilities, right? Your debts. But in the United States and us scholars who study wealth, wealth means so much more, right? Wealth is not just that definition. It's access, it's insurance, it's power in our society, right? And so when we're talking about wealth and when we're making this distinction between from income and wealth, we're talking about all those things that allow people to, especially in the context of our discussion in this conference, the ability to take risk and take substantial risk. And if those risks do not pan out, being able to rebound and live to see another day, right? And survive and persist. So I think that's really important to kind of underline where we're talking about, where we're starting from when we're talking about wealth. And when we talk about, when we start parsing that down and disaggregating it by race and by gender, and we talk about wealth gaps, we're saying that there are systems in place in our society that have created wealth-enhancing opportunities for a particular population and wealth-stripping or wealth-exploitative opportunities for particular Black communities and other communities of color. And what we find is that, as a result, these patterns, these gaps persist, and they perpetuate themselves across generations intergenerationally. And so, in particular, we look at women's wealth gap, which we're discussing right now, we have pay inequity. So that was raised earlier in this morning. The inability to, policies such as the lack of childcare or maternity leave for women who work in jobs where they can't access, these same types of programs, and so these lead to inequities in the ability to generate the same amount of wealth and income as their male counterparts. So really thinking about how the policies in place and systems in place do not allow women to generate, in particular Black women, the same types of income and wages that their male counterparts tend to generate in our society. So that's just the income. Obviously, there's other markets that we look at: housing, business sector, which is the focus of our conference here today. But where do the policies seep in where they are not getting access to resources that allow them to generate wealth? And if you can't take the risk, if you don't have the wealth, you can't take the risk, right? And you don't have the insurance underlying your decision or the ability to pursue the dream, pursue the idea to the same extent as other people do in our society. And I also want to highlight that because of these inequalities, because of these persistent inequities, when people take those risks and they fail, they have to start. They have to. They don't get the same opportunity to start back up again, right? That's really what we're seeing. Like the ability to redefine or restart again really is hindered if you can't succeed on that first go round. And I think that needs to be said as well. That's something that persists in our work.
So now, you described it very broadly, right? The phenomenon.
Yeah.
But in terms of your research, like what's like the latest, greatest finding that you have in a recent paper, or the things that's on your desk right now that you're like most passionate about in this area that you could possibly share with us?
Yeah, so it's not a good story. It's not a great story. So as I said, I've been spending a lot of time recently on student loan debt and racial disparities in student loan debt and how it's contributing to current racial wealth inequality. And so one of the things that we see if we look at the literature on Black women entrepreneurs is that they tend to be highly educated, have college degrees. But if we parse the racial wealth gap just looking at college graduates, it's the largest, right? So Black-white wealth gaps amongst college graduates is the largest. What we see in jargony or academic speak is that there's huge selection as to who can be able to make risk once you have, and who can succeed in that pool of women who are entrepreneurs and are succeeding in their businesses, right? Because they're starting with, as all the research that was shown this morning, with a lot less capital, a lot less access to resources. So they are persisting despite the greatest amount of odds, and among millennials with significant amount of debt that has been pushed on them in a predatory way, and is inhibiting their ability to generate wealth to the same extent and at the same rate as their white counterparts. So I think the explosiveness and the focus on student loan debt is, I think, rightfully so, because it has been so pervasive amongst millennials and amongst recent cohorts of young adults. But really, we need to start thinking about how it's disproportionately impacting Black borrowers, Black college attendees, and how it is inhibiting or is going to inhibit future asset accumulation, business ownership, and much more long-term consequences. So that's where my work has been really focusing on.
Yeah, I think it echoes one of the themes that we saw first during the first session that really caught my attention, something that I did not know about millennials, and the idea that you can have an unmarried man and an unmarried woman, and the unmarried woman has a substantial amount more of student debt, and then just the effect that has 10 years later on wealth, because it's a two-tier in terms of wealth, right? It's what we get, what we bring in, but also what we owe. And so that aspect of it was something that I didn't know. So I think that's some really cool stuff you have going on.
There's some great simulations out here that I've looked at, if you can't start accumulating or you're paying down debt at the same time as others are starting to make investments and save and start making those initial investments into business, it can really delay the amount of wealth accumulation over time that you acquire as you age throughout the life course. So really, some long-term impacts.
Good deal. Melissa, I want to shift to you and your research. So in your introduction, you talked about your focus on what happens within the organization.
Sure.
I thought it really interesting. Tom Shapiro in his discussion earlier was talking about those things that drive people out of the organization and into entrepreneurship, and this idea of control, right? Having more control over your own space and your own time and your own fate. And your research focuses on these career trajectories of women of color and varying organizational practices. So I would ask you, what organizational practices would you say most contribute to or help to reduce the wealth inequality for women of color?
I think it falls into three categories. I think first, there's a question of how do we value talent and how do we interpret talent, right? One of the popular phrases in the Bay Area is this idea of the leaky pipeline, right? When it comes to diversity in STEM. And the thing is, being at Stanford, working with, being able to work with undergraduate students of color, and to hear stories from them about the different forms of discrimination they face in their internships, job interviews, et cetera. And then I go to tech companies and tell them, and they're really surprised because they think, well, Stanford should be the bulletproof vest. And the thing is, it's not the case, right? So it's a question of access and a question of how you interpret who is talented. And then once you determine that we're talented enough to be in the room, right? It's the extra hurdles we have to continue to jump to prove that we're still smart enough to be in the room, that we're not the diversity hire, that we're not the affirmative action case, right? And I don't think I need to tell this room that more often than not, we have to be 3 times as smart, work 5 times as hard for like 60% of the income, right? And so the question is, to your point, the answer to your question about organizational practices is, why is it that we create environments for talented women of color and other underrepresented groups that we have to do that work? Because when I think about the technical expertise of the women I've gotten to interview over the last 2 years, I mean, it's there and probably higher than some of their counterparts. But they have to work so hard to earn the trust of their colleagues about whether or not they belong in the room that I think it pushes them out, right? Mm-hmm. So that's one practice. The other practice is where we're funneled in, right? So we can talk about the talent and the value of talent and how that's racialized and gendered. The other thing we can talk about is what jobs are we concentrated in? If I meet one more woman of color who, like, a couple years into the industry wants to go into diversity and inclusion, my heart's gonna break, right? Because the thing is, research has shown for decades that once we're funneled into diversity work, it's gonna be very hard to move out of that, right? The work I did before I got to Stanford was on nonprofits, right? And there were some comments during lunch about nonprofits and being funneled into these spaces. I think the other conversation that's not had is, why are nonprofits, education, and healthcare where we are concentrated? What is it about these industries that make them more accessible to us as women of color than like a tech company? Because, you know, at the end of the day, tech pays more than all these other industries. So that's the other piece, right? So it's talent, it's access to industry, it's how we're funneled into jobs, right? I just tweeted this, but one of my colleagues co-wrote a paper that evaluates the pay gap in federal agencies. And what they find is male-typed organizations are more likely to pay men more than women, right? And so if it's gender neutral, it's a human capital question, right? So we had to think about the character of the workplaces, the extent to which there's a masculine ideology about what the workers should be, and how that influences how we're getting paid.
Good deal. There was so much in there to attempt to unpack. The first point is emphasizing what emotional labor looks like, right?
Yes.
And emotional labor for women and women of color is oftentimes exceptionally high.
Yes.
It's draining, and that pushes us out.
Yes.
We also talked about the idea of concentrating us in occupational segregation in terms of where we are. Now, I'm curious, let's push that a little bit further, right? So we know the phenomenon occurs, we know it occurs frequently,
Yes.
documented, the stats are there.
Sure.
But in your opinion, what would you say would be the systemic procedure or policy that you have noticed occurs in organizations that perhaps is most responsible for that type of segregating?
I think recruitment, right? Where do we recruit? Again, being in Silicon Valley and hearing people's practices about what schools they go to, one of the things I do when I go into companies is, if you want innovation, why are you recruiting from the same 3 schools? And then, so there's recruitment practices. The other thing is, right, talking to people about how recruiters make decisions about which resumes to screen, right? Do you want, and I have a problem with this language, but I'm using it anyway. Do you want a diverse hire or do you want a talented hire? The fact that recruiters are making that distinction is extremely problematic, right? And so studies have shown, to your point, if we create a blind process of recruitment, your diversity pool increases, right? And so then, let's talk about retention. I think Silicon Valley has a lot of money and throws a lot of money at diversity initiatives, but there's no system of accountability. I really appreciated the question during lunch today about what's the system of accountability, right? We can talk about it in public policy, but we can also talk about it in organizations, right? And who's responsible for pushing that system of accountability in the organizations versus who gets to actually exercise their expertise, right? So it's a question of, to your point earlier, the emotional labor, the cultural taxation that happens for underrepresented groups in these companies. And so, so I think those are definitely some of the practices that reinforce these different forms of segregation.
Yeah, no, thank you for offering the practices as well as some of the solutions, because we know in a lot of organizations that have actively attempted to blind, they've had quite a bit of success. Actually, some companies have, created groups where they have hired people under their traditional way in which they would normally hire, and then half the group, and then hire the other half with a blinding procedure just to see what happens 3 years later. And what they found is that some people that would not have even been hired right? Under the regular processes, but were hired under the blinding processes, were actually some of their best performers. So we definitely need more companies that take that aggressive aggressive stance and consciously decide to recognize where these biases are introduced. And then the idea of retention. You know, we can't just get them in the door, right? But we also have to make sure that they know that they belong, and they're actually included. So there's diversify first, and then there's the inclusion as well as the belonging around retention.
And excuse me, and I think in the Bay, what I find the problem is there's so much money thrown at recruitment with ignoring retention, right? And I was talking to someone last night about this, right? The different generations, actually it was you. Yes. The different generations of people in the workplace, right? And there's a lot of us young professionals can learn from the people who've preceded us, but if you can't retain them, if you're creating such a toxic environment that they have to leave, then I think I'm starting from scratch. But the thing is I'm not starting from scratch. And I think a lot of young women of color face that. It's like, who do I learn from? Where do I go? Right? And that lost history means we have to reinvent the wheel, which prevents progress from happening, right? So it's not a formal organizational practice, but the informal practice becomes a formal practice that then continues that segregation process.
Right, and manifests and continues and perpetuates.
Yes,
absolutely. So Monique, Melissa introduced the concept or the idea of occupational segregation, and that many times that we are, in what I call the services, right? The human services, the social services, nonprofit services, and so on, but not necessarily in STEM. Right? And so many entities have an array of STEM and STEAM, which is a new thing, and where's Kristen, adding the arts to that programs. Can you kind of share your perception and your experiences about whether the focus on women in venture and technology has been equitable equity beneficial for women of color compared to women with this focus on STEM? Can you give a little insight there?
Short answer, no. And let me tell you how that occurs. So a few years ago, when the Me Too movement initially started, we had a lot of legacy venture capital companies who were taken to task about their lack of having female partners on their staff. And then you saw all of these venture firms go out and hire their first woman GP. It was usually a white or Asian woman. I don't know of any Black women or Latinx women GPs who were hired around that time. And it all happened because LPs held limited partners, people who invest in venture funds, held them to task over it. You have not seen any such movement for having people of color broadly at the table, and certainly not women of color. What you have seen is organizations spring up that say they are interested in seeing more success for women venture capitalists. So far, that has largely meant white and Asian women venture capitalists. And Black women VCs and Latinx women VCs have sort of been left out of that conversation. And so when you talk about all these initiatives to see more women in those investing seats, so far we've really only seen white women, centered. I think for the Black women in venture that I know, we've seen some women come into the industry who are really junior, and that's a really great thing. What we've unfortunately seen is not very many senior women who are either in senior roles at firms or able to start new firms. Right. And in fact, I think that most of us Black VCs who are senior are actually bypassing sitting at the table and waiting around for someone to promote us to managing director at an established firm, and we're taking the much harder route of going out and raising our own firms.
Which is what you're doing.
Yeah.
Well, one, we applaud you for doing that. That's the first thing.
Applaud me when it's done.
Yeah, I know the difficulties. I have some of those conversations. But let's stay in the big firms for just a moment, right? Those individuals, oftentimes you don't choose to bypass, right? So now, if you're in those big firms, what do you think it's going to take to move the needle? So like you, 2017 was, just a haven for gender discussions
Yeah.
in so many different, corporate environments, here at Fuqua, all across Duke. I mean, if you wanted anything women-related done, you got,
Yeah.
you had many people because there was that pressure. Absent that pressure, right? Absent that external pressure, what do you think it's going to take to move the needle such that we get that same response, that same energy we had around women of color?
It requires a monetary event. So it requires a firm or an investor missing out on something because they didn't have representation around the table who could have told them that this was a thing that they should invest in.
Yeah.
That's it. Money only moves the needle. That's it. Nothing else. Okay? Money moved the needle for me too. Like, the only reason why white and Asian women got a seat at the table was because the volume on Me Too was so high that limited partners were saying, you're not going to be able to get money from us unless you fix it. It wasn't because it was some like altruistic, we're going to do the right thing sort of movement. It was money. So money makes things happen.
So I have a comment that I'm going to bring Melissa because I see she wants to go. That is a bit depressing, right? In terms of having hope. Because what you just described is money, but money is going to be on an individual basis, right? It's going to be on a firm by firm basis. Whereas what you saw with Me Too, that was an industry, that moved because of that. So am I right to be depressed by your response?
No, because it's tangible.
Okay.
I mean, I get money. It's tangible, right? So if firms lose out on the next big company that goes public or that has some sort of major liquidity event, then they will say, oh no, we should have had the person at the table who could have told us that this was great. And then you will see an influx of people coming in. Now, that's not to say that there aren't great people, great investors, great white male fund managers managing funds who are, in some cases, trying to do the right thing and want to know, how do we, I get this question all the time where they ask me, well, how do we support women in venture? And I say all the time, the only thing you can do is like give us money or share deals, right? And I don't want like the bad deals that you are not gonna fund. I want that deal that you're giving to the person that you went to business school with. That's the amazing deal that you're cutting him in on. I wanted access to that deal, right?
But you told me not to be depressed, but I think I'm even more depressed by that response because it's contingent on certain things occurring, and that gives the power of movement to someone else. And so I'm trying not to be depressed, but I am a little bit. Now, Melissa, you got to chime in because you're like, I got to say something here.
I think I very much appreciate the big data we've been seeing all morning. I think, but to your point of women of color, none of this data cross-cuts, right? We're not centering women of color. When we ask questions, when we do the investigation, we're not talking about what's the experience of black women and how do I, to be a true social scientist, generalize, right? And how do we frame the problem? So I think it's a question, first we have to think about how we're collecting the data. So many companies are not collecting the data. They're not collecting the data at the intersections. And if we begin there, then maybe we can flip this conversation, right? To address some of the things Monique brought up.
So actually, I was going to go to Fenaba, but because of that response, let me go to you because it leads into a question that I have for you.
Okay.
And so, Melissa, there does not exist a lot of research on women entrepreneurs in general and women of color entrepreneurs specifically. So the fact that we have AFN and we had Tom's report, I mean, that's a huge start, and it's so much more than what we had previously. So my question to you is, if you were in control, you are a researcher.
Yeah.
What additional research is needed to better understand this phenomenon with regards to women of color? Because the problem with intersectionality research is that once you start dissecting and your N gets so small, you don't have the ability to generalize, and then you don't have that interest that you would like from a broader scope. So how do you balance that? So what research would you do? Yeah, where would you start?
I'm going to be an idealist, right? Because you're asking me where to start, and I don't operate in a box. Okay, so first it'd be a critique of the academy. How do we make space for deep, grounded, critical work? How do we start with the stories of women of color? How do we center that, right? To apply the lens of intersectionality on organizational practices since grad school. And people are like, what are you doing? I was like, these stories need to get told. I don't know what I'm gonna find, but to your point about the end is small, I have to start on the ground, right? Because the end is not small. It's just if you're using a big data set, talking about generalizability, you're not gonna get the 30 women of color. But if you start with the 30 black women, who will then introduce you to like 50 more, because we roll deep like that, then just truth to power. Then we can, maybe it's not about the small n, but it's about doing the careful, rigorous work of finding the women where we are, right? And the women of color where we are, and seeing how we do it well, right? Because, so then, one, start with women of color. Two, let's talk about our successes, right? To your point from earlier, this data is really depressing, right? But some of us have made it, and how do we center those stories? Right? Because when I think about whether it was me coming up as a student or me being like an early career professional, there aren't many people who look like me doing what I'm doing. So one of my personal missions in doing the research that I do is to make visible the success stories of women of color so that the next generation knows that they're not alone, that there are examples, right? And it demystifies the process. So that's where we start, is we take the time to find them because they exist. I also think it begs the question of how we understand wealth and how we conceptualize wealth, right? And what that means. There's income, there's debt to liability, debt to asset ratio, right? But like, let's talk about what Monique said in terms of social networks and how do we capitalize the knowledge in these social networks to help us grow collectively, right? Because I think, I'm going down a rabbit hole. When we think about capitalism rewards the individual entrepreneur, but I know my success is a collective process, and when we shift our mindset from the individual success to the collective success, I think that's when we can start seeing this change.
Okay, wonderful. Now, I'm going to push you a little bit further.
Sure, yep.
Because what I heard you respond to my question with is the sample, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so we're going to start with the 30, and then we're going to sample on the dependent variable. We're going to start look at the successes.
Sure.
I didn't hear your research question. What's the research question? What are we asking?
The research question is what makes you successful and what are the barriers? It's that simple, right? So when I started the interviews with women of color in tech and finance, how did you get into the industry, right? When other students, white and Asian, because I'm also on a project with youth in STEM at Stanford, it's fascinating. The degree to which it's accidental versus intentional by race is fascinating, right? And so I think successful women of color in elite professions have to a certain degree, have to be a lot more intentional than some of our other counterparts, right? If I have an extended network of people in the STEM fields, of course I'm gonna get into all this programming that's like cultivating me, and I'm gonna code by the time I mate, right? So that's one question. But really, I'm a grounded theorist, so sometimes it's just, I don't know what the question is until I identify a pattern, which again is not popular in social science, but I think that's where we discover new questions.
Yeah, a grounded approach, I think, would be very informative. So I think I hear you saying is that we saw a lot of stats this morning.
Yes.
A lot of stats that made us pause for a moment.
Yes.
Some of the stats was the teeny weeny bars.
Yes.
Right, let's go in and let's figure out what's happening in those teeny weeny bars.
Yes.
Good stuff.
Thanks.
Fenaba, we scratched the surface just a few moments ago and we talked about bias, right? Just a little bit. We talked about bias, but in your experience, what role do you perceive that bias plays in these varying barriers that women face? So a lot of the things this morning we talked about were structural and they were systemic and institutional, but if we're talking about the individual level, or you can go at the higher level, whichever aspect of bias that you choose, implicit, explicit, subtle, blatant, or otherwise. What role do you think that bias is playing in these barriers?
Yeah, so what bias does is it distorts people's perceptions of reality or a person's abilities. And so and I want to be very specific to the case of what we're talking about here in business and in corporate America or whatever, everyone has biases, everyone carries biases in making decisions, but if a decision maker or the people at the table hold biases, that is where this is where we replicate these gender issues and these gender biases and racial biases.
Can I stop you right there? It's not the question of if. We know that we hold these biases, right? That's like a base level. If you live in the world, you have a certain level of bias in terms of how women should be perceived, blacks should be perceived, black women should be perceived, Latinx women should be. So we know that occurs. It's not an if, right? Okay.
When the bias is being held by a decision maker that is distorting a person's ability to access capital, to access the jobs, to stay employed, to persist, to get into the wealth-generating positions,
Yeah.
that's when a bias is an issue, right? So, we can all, as you said, we all have our biases, but we know that when a person is actively acting on those biases in decision-making positions,
Right.
that is the problem, and that is what we need to address, and that is what, what we're talking about here, and that allows for persistent inequalities and inequities to fester.
So now we know that these biases exist. What do we do about them? So I am a Black woman. I want to start a business. I know that when I walk into the bank or when I walk, into her office, the other people are going to perceive me and ourselves. Is what my research says. Is that it's not just other people perceiving us; it's how we perceive ourselves. What do we do about it?
So I'm not sure if you're gonna. Well, I'll just say, I don't think it's on the onus of the individual, of the person, to address the bias. I don't think the onus should be on women. I don't think it should be on women of Black women. I don't think it should be on women of color to address the bias, right? It has to be on society, and that's, I have a policy background, so I'm policy-based, solutions in order to address these types of issues, because we can't rely on individuals to, and particularly the recipient of the bias to fix these. One thing I would like to say is that until the time when we are a majority or a collective mass in these spaces, I think we have to be able to identify allies and the people that are going to be able to be in the room, the supporters, the advocates, who understand these issues and can speak to these issues and call out these issues, right? Until that time, and also in conjunction with policy-based solutions to address these issues. So they do exist, they are out there, they're just not enough of them, and we need to make sure that we can call out and say, this person is an ally. And I will also say, call out the toxic people. So I have a lot of discussions in academia about toxic people in positions of power and decision-making power. And people say, oh, this person, what do we do? How do we work around them? Well, we need to call them out, right? We need to remove them from those positions. Like, just slowly move their office further and further until they can no longer, or they should not be holding those positions, especially if you think it's impacting how people perceive your organization and your business, and you don't want to be viewed that way, then they gotta go. They gotta go.
So I'll say two things on that before I open it up to the questions, and that is it can sometimes be really, really difficult to call that person out, especially when you're in that position of subordination to start with, whether that's with regard to identity or position. The other thing is that I think that sometimes it's not fair, it's not right, but it is reality, and that is sometimes we have to actively manage those perceptions and counteract them in order to get to those places such that we are decision makers. So definitely something to consider there. I think I will now open it up to questions, if you have any, for the last 20 minutes.
Differences in power. Well, what is a toxic environment? And under what? There are I imagine that there are moments or conditions where we can actually call them out, even if they're out there. So even if they are in a different position of power. So what were you thinking when you said toxic conditions?
I think if it prevents someone from doing their work or their job to the level that they know and believe that they can do their job. But it can be
that sounds like
health.
Something that needs to be called out. If it gets to, regardless of, it's delicate.
Right. So I guess I don't want to divert the conversation too much, but I think bullying behaviors, these types of behaviors that people kind of understand and have in their work environments, but also in meetings and whatever.
And what would you recommend? So you are in that position.
And just to move, before you move on to that question, let's just be more explicit, right? There's bullying, there's harassment, there's sexual harassment, there's gender discrimination, there is racial discrimination, there's immigration discrimination. So all of those types of things could create a toxic or hostile environment.
And once in my mind, once it becomes hostile, then it needs to be called out.
Right, and I guess I just want to say that all of these things can exist in spaces, and when people think, when they don't see us in those spaces, we should think about, are all these intersecting toxicities in this space, and the people that are there need to think about, why aren't these people there, and are they breeding or continuing to create a space in which those types of toxicities are allowed to persist?
Alyssa?
I also want to say a lot of these forms of discrimination are very apparent. Most of them are not, right? Let's talk about microaggressions, right? Those little paper cuts, right? How many times does a woman, I remember interviewing a woman who was excluded from, right, those informal networking events because she had a baby. And she had a male colleague say, well, no one told you to have a baby. She's like, it's not that big of a deal. And I'm like on the other end of the phone being like, okay. I'm ready to put my arms up, right? And so that's one thing. Sometimes it takes us a very long time to recognize it. And once we've put all the pieces together, right, it's like, well, now what? Because I've let it happen for so long. So I think first, to answer your question, we have to have these conversations early and often, right? The number of women of color I've interviewed who are like, I'm in here by myself, it's just me. And then I'm like, well, no, I've interviewed 30 women before you, and it's not you, right? We're not being transparent about how bad it is for each of us. And so first, let's have that conversation. Once we have that conversation, let's figure out what we can do. Like my colleague said, find out your allies. Right?
You cannot do it alone.
You can't do it alone, and we shouldn't be the ones naming it, right? Because our financial and professional security, like, rests on it. Let's talk about angry black woman syndrome. Let's talk about all these things, right? And so if we have a counterpart that's maybe in a more professionally privileged position to do the heavy lifting for us, then it helps, right, ease the emotional burden that we face. And I think we have to make decisions about what's best. I interviewed a woman in her 60s who, very clear case of racial discrimination, but she's like, I'm a few years from retirement and like full pension. She had to make a decision about what was best for her in the long run, right? And sometimes it's really just being transparent and being vulnerable to recognize what are our challenges and what's best for me economically, psychologically, et cetera.
Yeah, there exists a typology that gives recommendations in terms of, whether it's, the subtle to the blatant, and whether it's proximal, personal, or organizational, and all of those things kind of fall within the rubric that you were just describing, and they dictate or they document how people tend to respond under those varying dimensions. So I think the short answer is it's contextual, and it depends upon you, because you have to be careful about fear of retaliation. You want to be that trailblazer, but you want to be that employed trailblazer, right? You don't necessarily want to be the one that, leads the trail out the door because of, the activism. So it is very, very contextual, I think, and situational in terms of, what's your risk factor? I think, well, if it happens to, someone who's unmarried and has a nice little nest egg versus someone who is married with 3 kids, may not, well, then there's a certain level, of risk that's there. So I applaud the effort of calling out. I applaud the effort of considering allyship. And I think both of those ideas recognize the aspect of context, and also the idea of subtle versus blatant, I think, is very distinct, because you're saying it's hostile, right? I think that's when you say it's blatant, right? The subtle aspect of it is much more difficult to prove, but it's also one of the principal reasons that people leave. The blatant you fight, the subtle you tend to leave, because you don't leave the organization, you leave people and what they've done to you.
So one more thing, and then I'll shut up. So these are solutions to, like, from the individual that is being the recipient of the harassment. So these are things that we can do, and we know for a while, what happens. That some things are harder defined when you're trying to complain. But what do we do? What recommendations then should we do so that working How do we minimize that? How do we make these places a little bit harder? How do we make it a little? How do we make it a little bit harder for these places to support this culture? I mean, yes, I can do things at the individual level, but how can we make it harder so that those that have power and are there don't feel that they can rely on the culture of silence?
Monique, you want to chime in?
So I don't work within an organization, so that's one. But if we're going to talk about it from from an industry standpoint, you can push those people out. I mean, there are certainly people who've been pushed out of industries for their behavior, and there's an accepted sort of behavior that you have in an industry, and once people step outside of those lines, they get removed.
The other thing I would just chime in is that you're describing observer silence, right? And we know that there's a lot of research out there that helps to institute what we call bystander intervention, right? So instead of just watching it occur, it actually, because here's the thing, not everyone is a bad person because they're silent, and some people want to speak up, but they don't necessarily have the tools to do so. So recognizing the power of allyship, the power of intervention by the bystander, the person whose group isn't necessarily targeting, and the organization recognizing that just as you have all these other types of training, you should also have this type of training as well, especially if your organization has a history of these types of culture, but it does have to come from the organization to introduce this as a phenomenon under consideration. And we often know that those cultures in which have hostile environments for women or for underrepresented minorities, regardless of they tend not to be those that are going to be bringing in that type of training. And many times we see that an organization that has, like we saw at Uber, right, 25%, women engineers, but slowly went down to less than 5% because of that culture. So. Question up there?
So I'm happy that you all have talked about allies in this because I think it's really easy to kind of operate in an echo chamber in conferences like this. And so as a non-person of color, I guess how would you like allies to make themselves known to you, or what can they do, or how would you like them to advocate on your behalf, understanding that a lot of the allies that might be surrounding you have, not necessarily the power to write a check to fund your startup or tell the boss that they're exhibiting bias any more than you do. So how can the allies around you help, and how would you like them to interact with you to help kind of mitigate some of the negatives that you've been discussing?
Lisa, you want to chime in?
Tweaking language for a second, right? Advocating on our behalf. How about partnering with us in the struggle, right? First. Second, having a conversation, right? Professionals of color in elite spaces, more often than not, have to be the one building the bridge across difference. Most of us have spent our entire education and careers doing that. What would be nice to see is it go in the other direction, right? To survive in predominantly white spaces, professionals of color have to learn a variety of languages, right? Especially if you want to stay tied to our community, right? And so I invite you as an ally, what do I need to learn so I can be a better person, right? Put yourself in the position of as a student, right? Because when we walk into spaces, we have to figure out what language do I use, how do I show up, and all of these things, right? And so if it's long story short, it's building the bridge in the other direction, making yourself vulnerable, right? I'm a student, please help me. And actively listening, right? I think it becomes, the danger becomes, well, I'm an ally, I'm the expert. You may not be the expert, right? And so just learn the language, learn the vocabulary, and listen to the stories.
The other
Yeah,
thing
and
I
I
would say, oh, no, you please, you're the panelist.
I don't think it has to be as specific as, you walk into a meeting and you go, hey, I'm an ally, right? You're like,
Yes.
don't do that. But it's really, it's really about how you exhibit behavior, right? And so, I was at an event a week ago and I was speaking and, someone came up to me after I was done and asked me a very similar question. And I said, it's all about, when I walk into a room and it's a room full of white men, let's say, right? Is anyone coming up to me and saying hello and what do you do and being curious about just me and what I care about, right? So it's that opening of a bridge, right? And then also, I talked to this person about the transference of privilege. So if you know someone that I should know, but I don't, you make that introduction. You transfer that privilege that you have and that network that I don't have to me in order to you don't have to write a check, you don't have to, invest in something I'm doing. But what's great about being an ally is that you don't necessarily have to do that, but you can introduce me to someone who can be helpful to something that I'm doing. That's that transference of privilege that a lot of allies can do.
There were 2 points there that I was going to make. One, you made the first one. The second one I would say is, so once you identify yourself as an ally, the first thing you said is that you didn't necessarily know your power. The thing is, you have a great deal of power as an ally. Mobilize other allies together. I mean, having an ally, group, if you're working for an organization, I'm going to be the leader of the male allies. I'm going to be the leader of the race allies. I'm going to be leader of the immigrant. So identifying yourself, that alone has power, because when you walk into the room and people they don't know that you're an ally, people want to know who to go to, right? And think about how much easier it is for you to go to them than them coming to you in those spaces, those dominated spaces.
And just one more quick comment. I have been in a lot of rooms where I have to bring up a company and argue about it and defend it and, try to get other people to believe in the company that I want to invest in. One of the things that a really close friend of mine, he's a close friend of mine now, but we used to work together, did is, we would support each other on these companies. And I would, bring a company to the floor, and then if people were not feeling it, he would say, I think, to piggyback off of what Monique just said, blah, 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 here's why this company is great, right? And, it's very easy in those rooms for women's voices in particular to get subsumed. And so you as an ally can easily make sure that that doesn't happen by saying, I think Monique just said that thing you were trying to now repeat as yours. Right? And just do that simple thing.
Right here.
We talk about emotional labor today, and Melissa even mentioned the paper cuts. And a lot of times, everyone has to pay the cost to be the boss, but the cost that we pay is exponentially higher than others. Is there research being done in academia on the mental health and the cost of being a female entrepreneur or woman entrepreneur?
Fenaba or Melissa, you want to chime in there?
Not that I know of.
I was with you, and then you said female entrepreneur, and I was like, oh, because there's lots of work on the
Yeah.
mental load of being Black women,
Yeah.
just existing in our society.
Sure. And it's done in different elite professions. I can't think off the top of my head. That avenue is beginning to get explored. But in terms of entrepreneurship, the field is far behind.
I know you had your hand up. Oh, this one and then.
This morning, Mr. Bolding started off with the word decency, and really what I'm hearing is that this is all about decency and not about power. And, I appreciate that we all need to strive to be decent and that's the culture that we want to live in. But I'm old enough to remember when this conversation was happening, and I'm not sure that we've moved the mark that much. You all are amazing, and there are a number of you on the stage. But you touched on something, Monique, which was about money and power. And, it sounds like we're still asking permission for somebody to give us something or to be decent to us. And a lot of this conversation is not about the what or the can, but the how. How does that change, that structural change happen? And I do feel like that's something that, and with the power that we need to, at least if we can't change it, we need to really recognize that that's what this is about. It isn't really just about decency and one person recognizing that, hey, I can be an ally, teach me how to be a better ally, because that's a conversation we've been having. And I don't mean that to be a Debbie Downer, but I do think that we have to really recognize what we're talking about. You all are successful because you're talented and you're smart and you've been able to exert power where you needed to exert power, but you are really still the exception. And so until we figure out something that's more structural, at least we should be kind of lead with that when we're thinking about this whole conversation.
Monique, do you want to respond? What's her comment? Oh, not anymore?
I guess my comment is, as it relates to allies, and I hear your comment, there are instances when people don't even know that a toxic environment exists, right? So it's not being the quiet observer. It's really understanding the organizational culture and working within those constraints. And there are ways to do it. There's a cost to it in many cases, but we wouldn't be sitting here if that didn't happen some years ago, right? So as it relates to your question in the back, I think there are times when we've made a comment at a board meeting and nobody heard it, but when someone else said it, they heard it. But the person who repeated it doesn't even realize that you said it.
Right.
Because we're in this context of, her voice doesn't mean a whole lot. So I think it's a growing situation that we continue to vocalize and sometimes make quiet noise. Sometimes we have to make quiet noise, and that is operating in the context that we're not going to conform. We're going to work within, but we're not conforming. And we're going to lead by following. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I'll leave it at the comment. We have this side over here.
This side
over here, yes.
While you're passing the mic, the invisible woman syndrome, right? Something that sometimes people do is what we call perception checking. So the time to check that perception is not in that meeting frequently, because people will say, why are you so bent out of shape? But the time for perception checking is after that meeting. And the thing is, if you perception check enough, what the research says is that if the person is open, then it will reduce the likelihood that it'll happen again. But that perception checking is one way. And what the suggestion is that you talk to that person, hey, I mentioned, X at the meeting. Not in the meeting, but after, the meeting. And then if it happens again, you do it again, right? And then if it happens again, you do it again, making them aware subtly, but with the less likelihood of having retaliation. Yeah.
I just wanted to jump in right there, and it relates, I think more than decency, it relates to trust. We don't trust each other. And we've not really made an effort to do that across ranks, across races. And once we can develop trust and respect, then we can have those kind of conversations.
Right.
Thank you for the two comments from the two sisters in front of me. What I would also offer is that, and Carmen and I both do a lot of racial equity work, and what I'm looking for is not an ally, I'm looking for an accomplice. I need somebody. That's right. I need somebody who's going to come with me when I call. I do who come on and go, no questions asked. Allies fine for those that want them. I want an accomplice. We both going down to the police station together. So what I would advise anybody who wants to accompany me, and this is what our white friends do, is start educating yourself now about what we're going through. There are all kind of caucuses. We belong to a group called Organizing Against Racism, and we meet together and we form groups and we have discussions and we get to know each other and get to understand the problems and the issues, because you can't advocate for me if you don't understand what I'm going through. And so, and then we break apart in groups. We have people of color group where we can get together and talk about our stuff, and then there are white people organizing against racism who meet together and they talk about their stuff, and we come back together as a group. So anybody who wants to accompany me, you're welcome to do it, but I want you to do your homework first so you know, because we can't just go out here in this cruel world and pretend that everything's okay, and we're going to be in trouble. We're going to have some issues. Thank you.
Was there one more?
Well, that sounded good. Hey. I heard a number of things that really made me want to share. The Federal Bureau of Prisons is 89 years old this year. And in that 89 years, I am the only African-American female that has held the position of Chief of Security at a United States penitentiary. That time was one of the most difficult times in my life because it is an extremely exclusionary environment anyway when you're dealing with law enforcement. But you can't, a lot of folks ask me why did I go that route, because I could have gotten the warden a different way. But I told them because I should be able to get to warden any way that I want. And they're not going to give you the end, you have to take it. And when one of the things that you also have to remember is it's a lot easier when you can point to someone and say, this person is discriminating against me, that person is discriminating against me, and then you can call them out. You can if you need to, but generally what they use is systemic racism. So when they use systemic racism, what they do is they dig up this 50-year-old policy that you violated that everyone else has always violated. No one even knows that the policy is on the books. Okay? And they say, well, you violated this policy. We're not discriminating against you. You violated this policy. And then when you say, but everyone violates this policy, they go, well, we're not talking about everyone.
Everyone, we're talking about you.
We're talking about you.
Yeah.
Okay? And then everyone else is like, oh, you tried to take us down with you. So the bottom line is that, you know, and I did think about it with the question about the ally, and thank you so much. And I've heard it a couple of times in here. But I did have such allies, people that said, well, you know, I think that this is a good idea. And they said, you know what, man, I think that's an awesome idea. He said, yeah, it was even good a few minutes ago when LA said it. Okay? When you have someone that's not afraid to stand up, and you do have more power, it's just that by virtue of the fact that you live with that power, you don't recognize it. But you have more. And I love the fact just that you asked. And that is amazing. And then what we do is when one of us does get into that environment, because it's going to cost you. You got to pay the cost to get in there, because there's a lot of people that don't want you in there because you don't look like the rest of them. But when you do get in there and you do pay that cost, when the next one comes along, be there for that one. Don't say, well, you know what? I had to pay my dues. It was hard for me, so it's going to have to be hard for her, too. My job is to make sure that it's never as hard for anyone else as it was for me.
Yeah. So first and foremost, congratulations on all of your achievements. You are a role model for, I think, many individuals. And so the fact that you're someone who is paying it forward and is going to be pulling up, you know, that gives us hope. But in everything that you said, you summarized a lot of the highlights of the discussion. So my job is minimal, but talking about systemic bias, we didn't really talk about that a lot. And that's just scratching the surface. Allyship and the cost right, of speaking up. And I think most importantly, and that is, if you make it, make sure you're pulling other people up. So a lot of fantastic highlights. As we wrap up, I want to give my panelists the final parting words, whatever they may be, your thoughts or your summation of what you have heard or hear, or perhaps that one piece of advice that you think gleaned from this discussion, or the one piece of advice that you tend to give out most frequently when you find yourselves in these discussions. We can start here with Monique, is that okay?
Let's start at the end.
Okay, we'll start here with Melissa.
Or do you want me? Or
Yes.
we'll start? Okay. I guess I just want to say that I think in hearing, I loved all the comments and questions that we received. I just want to be clear that the systems are in place. They're inherently unequal, and a lot of people benefit off of the inequalities of the ways that the systems are formed. And that's what my work does. It calls out those inequalities and shows how the systems and the structures in place are built and set up to make sure that they persist, because relinquishing power is hard, right? So, so I just want to say that I appreciate Monique's point about money, because I do think money is important. So if you're going to bind yourself to someone in solidarity and allyship and as accomplices, how you have to prove or show or make the case that we are both going to be more powerful. We're both going to have more economic growth. We're both going to have more profit. We were all, like the whole organization, because the inequality, because there's too many people benefiting off of the inequalities that are inherent in the system for them to want to change it just based on trust and goodwill and decency. I don't mean to be negative, but I think that that's the case.
Thank you, Fenaba. Melissa.
3 things. First, recognize your own power. Second, find people who don't let you forget how powerful you are. And then third, don't ask for a seat at the table, but build your own table.
All right.
And last?
So just for all of the allies and accomplices in the room, of all races, one of the things that I've seen happen is that for an ally, their ability to help, sometimes a male ally, their ability to help and support sometimes ends where my ambition begins. And I think it's really important that you all support the ambitions of the women who are around you, even when their ambition goes beyond you, right? And that's it.
Awesome. With that, I think we should give our panelists a round of applause. And I will turn it over to Gwen, who will tell us what's next.
So thank you, and amen, sisters. So we are going to prepare for our workshop, which is right down the hall in the HCA classroom.